before we even get that far, as I'm sure you know, the name of the podcast is The Big Questions.
Right.
And I always start every episode with the same question. To me, it's the most profound and complicated question we can ask. For some people,
Mhm.
it's just a one word answer. For others, it's a long story. There's no right or wrong way to answer it. So I will ask you, who are you?
Who am I? Well, I guess it depends on whether you're asking who am I as a spiritual being or who am I in my physical form today. And if you're talking about me in physical form today, then I'm a person who values truth and love and compassion, wisdom, um, integrity, dignity in all humanity. And love for one another. And I'm not talking about romantic love, as you know. I'm talking about that deep love from which we're all made. If I were telling you who I am spiritually, in the teaching that I'm in, I would say I'm spirit having a human experience because we're all born of spirit, and uh, it's who we are, and it just depends upon what our connection is with spirit, the divine, God, Buddha, George, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter. That answers to any name because it's not that old man up on a cloud, that so many I grew up with as a little girl. And it was always really strange to me. I thought, well, gosh, if that's who God is, he must be so busy. He must be so busy. He couldn't possibly have time for me. I mean, he's looking after the whole world. He's, trying to stop wars. That's how my little mind was working. And it wasn't, I then was told, of course, that God was some old man sitting on a cloud wearing a pink nightie and judging us and punishing us, if we're bad. Sort of sounded like Santa Claus, you better watch out, you better not cry, I better not pout, I'm telling you why. So even as a little girl, I mean, when I was 2, I went to church. There was a church just a couple of doors down the street from where we lived. And my parents never went to church. And I really didn't have much parenting. I had practically none. So I used to just toddle off down the street and go to church. And when I was really, really bad, I wasn't allowed to go to church on Sunday. So I
That
would
was
just
your
go.
punishment.
Yeah, that was my punishment, that I wasn't
Wow.
allowed to go to church. So I would go and sit in the front row, and probably the minister thought that I belonged to somebody at the back because I was just a little tiny thing. And then I would leave when everybody left, and I would go home. And all of my aunts and uncles lived within just, a few hundred yards of one another. So I used to line my cousins up on the fence and preach to them. And
So it goes back a long ways
it
for
goes
you, this
back
ministry.
a
Yeah.
long way, and they didn't like it at all. I mean, it was sort of like, oh, here she comes, get out of her way. And they were all a lot older than me. It's interesting how I could even get them to line up on the fence, but for some reason they did for a while. But as I was getting a little bit older, and I know I'm digressing from your question, but as I was getting a little bit older, I was looking for a God I could understand
Hmm.
because that God made no sense to me. So we're all spirit having a human experience. We're all one.
Yes.
Um,
Well, you're preaching to the choir, and I don't think you digressed at all. I mean, I've had people go on for about 10 minutes when I ask them who they are. So,
oh, okay.
like I say, there's no right or wrong way. That's what I love about that question, and people can
Yeah.
take it many different directions. But just for matters of sort of material practicality, what's your name?
Oh, my name is Carrie Hunter.
Yeah, and what do you do, Carrie, for a
I'm
living, if you will?
for a living. Depends on how you define living. Um, I'm the senior minister at the Center for Spiritual Living Victoria, and I've been in Victoria for 6 years in that position.
Wow, very cool. So, were you in Victoria before you started, or have you
No,
been? No, okay.
no, I was invited to come out to do a workshop at a different church in Victoria, another New Thought church. And it was September 2nd that I did the workshop. And this would have been 2014. And I have a daughter who lives in Banff, and I was living in Banff for a couple of years for reasons I don't need to go into. And my daughter sent me a text, and I had left my phone on, and I said to my friend Georgia, I really need to leave my phone on because I'm expecting my kids to get in touch with me. And Georgia said, no problem. Anyway, a text came through from my daughter in Banff, and it had snowed 22 inches on September 2nd. And I said to Georgia, I'm never going back. This is it. I'm never going back. And she
Uh,
said, well, I'm going to Palm Springs for 6 months, and I was going to put my furniture in storage and move to Vancouver. So why don't you sublet my place and see how you like Victoria? And I thought, well, what a good idea. So I went home and arranged to move out on the 1st of October. And I just packed a few things because her place was furnished. And I, packed my books and music and a few clothes and so on. And I was about to shut down my computer, and a message popped up that there was a church in Victoria that was looking for a minister, and it was the Center for Spiritual Living Victoria, and they were looking for somebody of that particular faith to become their senior minister. And I just thought, well, so I sat down and just filled out an application, sent it to head office, and then I was invited to candidate in October, and I received a call on November 26th saying that or offering me the job beginning January 1st of 2015. Um, they go through a process. There were 3 finalists, and it sounds like a beauty pageant or something. And then, uh, and then the congregation votes.
Very
So,
cool.
so I've been there since January of 2015. But no, I hadn't. Victoria hadn't been on my radar. My daughter and son-in-law lived here for a while. They studied Chinese medicine in Victoria, and then they moved back to Banff. But it hadn't been on my radar. It was, and when things like that happen, you just know you're in the right place. It's the right thing. There was no stress. There was no worry about it. I hadn't even considered it. It was like it just tapped me on the shoulder. But I
Mm.
had been a minister for, well, now I've been a minister for 17 years, so it wasn't as if ministry was new to me. But
And you
I think
mentioned
I found,
they were looking for a candidate in that faith.
yes,
What is that faith? What do
it's
you call
called,
it?
yeah, it's called science of mind. It has sometimes been called religious science, which always, people get the heebie-jeebies. They think, oh, is it Scientology? Is it that thing that John Travolta's part of? Which it isn't at all.
Yeah.
The Science of Mind was founded by a man named Ernest Holmes. And Ernest Holmes, back in the late 1800s, was studying. He dropped out of school at age 17. He was just totally bored with school. And he read the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And there was something in Emerson's work that just caught him. And he couldn't get enough of it. And then he started studying world religions and studying all of the great philosophers. And somebody who had a big impact on him was Judge Thomas Troward, who was a judge in India. When he retired, he went back to England, which was his home, and he started to write at that point. And Ernest Holmes read Troward's work, which is really tough slogging, and um, and I can see Troward's influence in Ernest Holmes' work. Every once in a while I come across something and I say, "Oh, that was Thomas Troward." But anyway, Ernest Holmes had decided he was going to go to Los Angeles and become an actor, and he was going to go to acting school. And he'd been studying Troward, and he was invited somewhere on a Sunday afternoon to have tea at someone's home in the parlor. And I don't know how many people were there, probably about 8 or 9 people. And they asked him a question, and he started talking about Troward's work. And at the end of the day, the hostess asked him if he would come back every Sunday and speak. And she said, we will pay you 25 cents a week, 25 cents each,
Mm.
which I guess was big money back then. I don't know. Fortunately, I wasn't around at the time. And so he did that. And within a period of a few months, he was speaking in a large auditorium. And then a year later, he was speaking to 3,000 people a week on Wednesday nights in Beverly Hills. And all the glitz of Hollywood, was there. Cary Grant and Doris Day and Peggy Lee. Peggy Lee called herself his adopted daughter
Mm.
and hung out with him and his wife a lot. He was a very charismatic speaker, And if you listen to him online, I mean, I don't get that impression from him, but I guess in person had an amazing energy. And he taught 2,000 people to become practitioners. And at that point, there was no name to this faith. Um, Practitioners meant that he taught people how to pray in a scientific way, which is very different from the kind of prayer that we're accustomed to, which is sometimes called begging, bartering, and beseeching. and, uh, so he came up with a scientific approach to prayer and trained 2,000 people in it, and people were really successful with it. And I think that, and I'm going to digress here just a little bit, but it's about prayer. I think the reason that it was so successful and people were basically performing miracles like the Jesus type thing that we read about or read about um, is because they were not, they didn't have the level of sophistication. And I don't even know if that's the right word, but the level of sophistication and the awareness of science that we have today.
Mhm.
And so it was easy for them to believe. Uh, well, going on with that, and then I'll go back to prayer. Um, he was he. A lot of people approached him and said, "You have to start a church." And he said, "This is not a church. I don't want to do a church. This is not a religion." And they kept at him, and finally he acquiesced and said, "Okay, he would do that." And it became really popular. And he had a radio broadcast,
Wow.
so people knew of him during those early days.
Yep.
They knew who he was. He was basically a celebrity in his own right. He mingled with political figures of the day and with all kinds of interesting people. And he was just this simple, in a way, a simple man in terms of being very humble. But he knew his faith.
Mm.
And when I love the stories about him in books that have been written about him as opposed to just the textbooks, because I mean, he was incredibly bright. He loved company, and he and his wife would have people come and stay for the weekend, and he'd get up and bake them muffins in the morning, and and then he'd go about his writing for the day. But he just had this amazing knowledge, and it's one of the things that absolutely stuns me when I think about it, because we're talking about, in the early part of the 1900s,
Mhm.
and he actually clearly understood what quantum physics is revealing to us today. He understood that when you focus upon something with intent and with some passion behind it, that your words, your thoughts start to create a reality. So, in fact, when our thoughts are impressed upon the invisible, something starts to materialize in the invisible. And this has been proven now. I mean, Harvard, when I first started looking up quantum physics and wanting to know more about this, and this was probably about 20 years ago, Harvard had already done something like 100,000 studies.
Mhm.
And they'd most of the universities had done studies on prayer. Now, this is not the only way that prayer works. I would be, I don't think I would have my license pulled for saying that. All prayer works when there's a depth of passion behind it. But when I said that people were less sophisticated then, um, they were in a way that it was a simpler time in which to live, as we know.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about my granddaughters when they were little tots, and they lived in Switzerland, and they came to visit me. And they were outside bouncing on the trampoline one day, and Jemima was the younger one, and Jemima was 4 and Sadie was 6. And all of a sudden I heard Jemima cry, and I went racing out the door and around to the trampoline, and she was sitting there, and she had fallen and cut her hand on a spring. And so I sat there with her and held her, and her sister said to her, the girls called me Kukum. And Sadie said to Jemima, tell tell Kukum to talk to God, Jemima. That's what she does. And I thought, and they had a little accent, and I didn't know that they really knew much about what I did. And so Jemima was sitting there kind of, and you have little children, you know what that's like. And so anyway, I sat with her, and Sadie said, "Come on, talk to God." So I did a prayer, and I didn't know that. I mean, I didn't expect them to, but each time I spoke a line, they would repeat it after me. It was so cute. And then we always finish our prayer or spiritual mind treatment, as we call it, with the words, "and so it is," meaning it's done.
Right.
And so I said, "and so it is." And they both shouted out, "and so it is." And so I took Jemima in the house and cleaned her hand and put a bandage on it. And later in the afternoon, she twisted her ankle and she was crying again. So I went
Mm.
back out, and Sadie said, "How's your hand, Jemima?" And Jemima took the bandage off, and it was totally healed.
Wow.
And Sadie said to her, "See, God did listen." So
That's
anyway, and
incredible.
the ankle was fine,
Yeah.
an hour later. When Jemima was 13, she was visiting me and she sprained her ankle, and I said, "Would you like me to pray?" And she said, "Oh, yes, please." So I prayed, and a couple of hours later I said, "How's your ankle?" And she said, "Didn't work." you know.
There are limits.
But she had gone from being 3 years old to
Yes.
being 16 years old.
Right.
And the difference then is you go to school and you start getting educated into the scientific way, the Newtonian age,
Mm.
rather than, and we've moved out of the Newtonian age and we're in the quantum age. The thing is that most of the universities are still teaching Newtonian physics.
Well,
Um,
and as I understand it, Newtonian physics, even though it's a deeply flawed and inaccurate model, it still works really, really well to make
mhm,
real predictions in the world. So even though Newton got a
yep,
lot of things fundamentally wrong, the equations and the math and everything works
yeah.
out, which makes it's interesting to me that it can be disproven in a lot of ways, but it still has value, right?
Well, it's important.
Mm.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, I don't think that it should ever be just eliminated and then just go into quantum physics. Um, you know, Obviously, we need to be dealing with the visible and the invisible,
Correct.
the
Yeah.
material world and the world that we can't see.
Yeah.
So anyway, very long, very long way of answering. I don't even remember what the question. Oh, what is religious science about?
Yeah.
So religious science teaches that we are all individualized expressions of God.
Mhm.
Um, and again, it doesn't matter what you call God. It goes. I mean, the universe, source, the
Tao,
create,
Brahman.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Lots of
It doesn't.
options.
It doesn't matter. Um, and the analogy that I like to use is that if you're sitting looking at the ocean, um, and and I would use as a metaphor that the ocean is like a great sea of God.
Hmm.
If you consider that everything is God, then the ocean is the great sea of God. And you see a wave coming in. The wave is still part of the ocean, and yet it's individualized because it's a wave, but it's not separate from.
Mm.
And so in that same way, we teach that there's only one, and that oneness is spirit, but we are individualized as spiritual beings. There's no place where you or I leave off and God begins. The energy, the intelligence, I like to call it an intelligence. There's no place where we leave off and it begins, and uh, and vice versa. And it's always there. It never leaves us. We step away from it. Uh, we're the ones who lose it because we're not um, practicing. We're not consciously in alignment.
Yeah, we throw up
Um,
barriers. Like it
yeah,
sounds like that, with your granddaughter when she was 16, she had a lot of barriers now,
yeah,
right? A lot
yeah,
of beliefs about what's possible, what's not possible, how the human body works, and those things they got in the way or they can get in the way. They separate us.
yeah. She was well programmed,
Right.
as we, as
Yeah.
we, as we all were. I just
Yeah.
say we're just all computers, or we're like computers, when we're born, and depending upon the kind of parenting that we have and the kind of education we have, the people who influence us, um, that's we then become we become adults who may be um, flawed in a number of ways because we've forgotten who we are. And I
Yeah.
think we're all born knowing who we are. There's a wonderful story when, oh gosh, I guess it was about the year no, it was 1990. I went to Maui for a few weeks on holiday and did a workshop there. I didn't lead it. I was taking a workshop, and it was really really interesting to um, to just go into things. And this was before. I mean, I was a practitioner then, but I wasn't yet a minister.
Hmm.
Um, and I was partnered in a dyad with a young man named Paul. I don't remember his last name now, although we corresponded for a few years during the snail mail years. And Paul was a dance therapist and was, probably about 20 or 30 years younger than I. And I knew that he really wanted to work with one of the cute young girls in the room, but he got stuck with me down at the end of the row. But we became friends. And Paul sent me a letter. I was living in Vancouver then, I guess. And he sent me a letter saying that he'd been to Salt Spring Island and had done a dance workshop there. And there was a woman named Susie, and Susie had just had her second child. And you may have heard this story before, but when Susie and her husband brought the baby home from the hospital, their little girl, who was, I think, 3, wanted to be alone with her little brother. And they thought that was kind of strange, but she was a really good little girl, and they said, sure. And then that was it, nothing. And then a few weeks later, she said, I need to be alone with my little brother again. And they had uh, a baby monitor in the nursery. And so they said, okay, fine, you can. So she went in and everything was just quiet for a minute or two. And then her little voice said, I need you to tell me about God because I'm starting to forget.
Oh man.
And when I read that, I still just have goosebumps or God bumps all over my body. And this story has been reproduced in a number of books in subsequent years, and it's usually accredited to somebody on the island of Molokai,
Hmm.
but it actually happened on Salt Spring Island. And I have a dear friend who lives on Salt Spring, and I was telling him about this at the time, and he said, "Oh, yeah, Susie's a friend of ours."
That's funny.
And so it all kind of came together. It wasn't somebody
Yeah.
just making up a story. But I think that we're all born knowing. I think that at 2 years of age, I still had some connection there that I didn't have, through all of my growing up years.
Hmm.
Um, and and I don't. It's not that I ever really forgot. It's just that I was still searching for that God I could understand. And the first time I walked into a Science of Mind church, it was then called the Center for Spiritual Living, as opposed to the um, Center for Spiritual Life, as opposed to Center for Spiritual Living. And I walked through the door and I started to cry.
Hmm.
And no one had said anything. There was this energy, and all of a sudden I remembered the story about the little girl. And I thought, this is the place I'm going to remember what I forgot.
Hmm.
And I sat there with tears just streaming down. I didn't know what the minister was talking about. I didn't have a clue. It was God is inside us. Like, that was so foreign to me. And yet, even though it was foreign, it was true. And so what Science of Mind is it is it's a science, it's a philosophy,
Mhm.
it's a religion. Combine the three. Um, the scientific part of it, as I said, I'm in awe that Ernest Holmes understood this at the time that he was around and teaching. Um, and in terms of religion, it's something that has become its own expression. We're we're a lot like Unity, but we don't rely upon the teachings of Jesus the way that Unity
Hmm.
does.
Okay.
We call ourselves a New Thought church.
Right.
New Thought, ancient wisdom.
Right.
So, uh, I mean, and there are people who will say, oh, it's a cult. It has to be a cult. Um, but more and more people are now open to this. And I mean, I meet so many young people today who are seeking. They don't, I mean, look at the churches are failing. I mean, the big
Yeah.
old churches.
Mainstream. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
I
and I
mean,
think it's because what you described, right? This image that most people have of an old, invisible, bearded sky daddy,
mhm,
versus the sort of intuitive or experiential knowledge that there's something within yourself that is beyond and, you know, just, yeah, transcended basically. And so people might have that intuition that there's something within them, but then when you tell them God is inside of you, they're thinking, this bearded sky daddy's inside of me? That doesn't make sense. What are you talking about, right? So I think the first step is overcoming this really outdated image of God, this
yes,
concept of God as a personification of the God King of Sumeria, and
exactly.
this ancient culture that gave rise to this image, right?
Yeah, and things that were recorded as history that, were just the spoken word for such a long, long time.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think, if you look at the Bible, which we don't use in our center, but we had to study it as ministerial
Hmm.
students. I threw it at the wall a few times, but because it's so contradictory.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to. I would never criticize another person for their faith.
No.
There are many paths to God, and however you get there, if your heart expands with it, and if it's about love, to me, it's fabulous. It doesn't matter. I just don't want to be part of anything that is like a kill for Jesus movement.
Hateful,
You know.
divisive, all of that
Yes.
misses the point altogether. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, the proof is
Yeah.
in the pudding, right? I mean, when you tell me what you believe, if somebody tells me they're a Christian or whatever, that tells me nothing.
Exactly.
Tells me nothing. I've met Christians who are antichrists. When you actually study the word of Christ, and then you watch what some of these people in the south of us are doing in the name of Jesus, you're like, you guys never read it. You guys
Yeah.
don't know what he says at all.
It's true. And the thing is, so many people who call themselves Christians are actually quoting the Old Testament.
Mm,
The first five chapters are the Jewish faith, and or the first five books rather of the Bible are the Jewish faith, and they call themselves Christians, but they're not quoting the New Testament. They're not following the teachings of Jesus, which were about loving one another.
yeah.
I mean, in the Old Testament, it's like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Thou
And
shalt
then
not kill unless I
and
told you to. And then you kill all of them,
then you can
every
kill them
single
all.
last one
Yeah.
of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as I say, I don't want to I don't want to criticize anyone else. But what I have found is that ministers in other faiths whom I've met, not very many of them, and of course I haven't met a lot of them, but many of them that I have met, if I've heard them speak, I've been stunned that they are now speaking the same language that we're speaking in Science of Mind.
Mm,
Um, Gary Patterson, who was at St. Andrew's Wesley in Vancouver. I lived in Vancouver for many years, and on Sunday afternoons at 4 o'clock, I used to go to his services because he spoke the same thing. But he
mm,
did something called Jazz Vespers, which I think the Unitarian Church
yep.
does here. But every week on Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, there would be a different band, and they could play whatever music they wanted, and Gary would speak for 5 minutes, and then there'd be music, and then he'd speak. And I used to do services like that in Vancouver. I'm not
Nice.
doing them here. Just don't have the right music yet.
Right.
Um, but he and I became friends. We became prayer partners. And I was just astonished to sit and listen to him and to see him, um, for want of a better word, baptize children, babies, and using exactly the same language that we use. And I think that's why we became friends and prayer partners. And he became the moderator of the United Church of Canada.
Wow.
And so his influence has been felt in a lot of major cities and big churches, but in small towns,
Not so
those
much.
ministers are just clinging to the old Bible and the way things used to be. And I went back to Banff and went to church one Sunday, to the United Church, because that's where I used to go. And it used to be filled to the rafters, people spilling out onto the street practically. And there were 8 people there.
Wow.
And I just thought, what's happened here? And it was the old, tired, dusty, cobwebby, you
Born
know.
a sinner.
Yeah.
Repent.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Fire and
Yeah.
brimstone.
Yeah. I mean, I can't even speak those words, So, I know that there are a lot of people seeking, they don't really know what they're looking for. Um, and a lot of young children today are just born with it,
Hmm.
and they remember. And I mean, my grandson Jake, until he was 11, he remembered everything. We had spiritual discussions all the time, and when I would go to visit, and I remember he called me one Sunday morning, and I was just about to go to church in Vancouver, and he was 3, and he was born talking, and he asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm just getting ready to go to church. And he said, you go to church? And I said, yes. And he said, churches are bad. And I said, what do you mean churches are bad? And he said, they don't tell the truth about God.
Mm.
And I said, well, gosh, Jake, I'm going to be a minister. And he said, oh, well, I would go to your church because I know you'd never lie about God.
Well, and I mean, again, I'm not wholly familiar with science of mind, obviously, and I'm
Mm.
interested to learn more about it from you. But from what you've said so far, it doesn't surprise me that you and a Christian minister would happen to be speaking the same language, because to me, what you're saying is the language of mysticism, which has been around for thousands and thousands of years, one being
Exactly.
expressing itself uniquely through different forms. And so, whether it's science of mind or the Bhagavad Gita or the Tao Te Ching, they're all saying the same thing. And when you understand the message, the words themselves are kind of just pointing, right? I mean, they're not that important. So, but what I was going to say is talking about God is tricky, because as soon as you start saying something, it's gone,
Yeah.
right? In
Yeah.
my experience, God is, or the divine, or whatever you want to call it, is something that is felt. And as soon as you start talking about it, you're straying away from it.
Well, and the thing is that there are no words. There are no words to describe it. One of the things, I mean, with spiritual mind treatment, as practitioners and as ministers, we were taught to use it all the time. And I heard one day, or I read somewhere, that Ernest Holmes always prayed in silence.
Mm,
And I mean, he, there was there's a story of um, a minister who was the founding minister of Founders Church in LA, and Ernest Holmes' closest friend. And one day they were sitting in Jack Hornaday's car, and it was a convertible, and Jack went to roll the windows up and crushed Ernest Holmes' pinky finger. And he said, I've got to get you to the hospital right away. And Ernest Holmes just said no, and he sat there with his hand around his little finger for 10 minutes, just in total silence, took his hand away, finger healed. I mean, that's the Jesus stuff. Um,
absolutely.
and the thing is, when I heard that Ernest Holmes always prayed in silence, I thought, what does he say in the silence? Like, for 2 weeks, I was a ministerial student at the time, but I did a lot of prayer with people, and I was wandering around thinking, what on earth was he thinking? What was his connection? And it troubled me. I thought, if I could only ask him one question, if he would just come to me so I could ask him one question. And a few nights later, an elderly woman in the congregation called me and asked if I would pray with her. And I said, of course I will. And she said, I'm just not feeling well. So she said, when you finished praying, could we just be together in the silence for a little bit? And I said, of course. So finished the prayer, and I didn't say, and so it is. I said, we'll finish it that way when we feel it's done. I don't know how long we sat there. I don't know if it was 10 minutes, if it was 20 minutes, if it was half an hour in silence when I'd finished the prayer. And but we were just in silence, and I was sitting there, and I just had tears just pouring down my cheeks, and my heart just expanded. The love was so profound. And after a while, Barbara's little voice, she was crying, and she said, it's done. And I
Mm,
said, and so it is. And neither of us spoke again until Sunday. And she came up to me on Sunday to thank me. And I said, no, I thank you because I've been asking the question. And now I know that there are no words, that what is the healing force is love. And
yeah.
when you go into the silence and you actually feel that connection within, then you're in a place of that pure unconditional love, which is, so many people say, oh, well, I love so and so unconditionally. No, they don't. I mean, we we get it, we lose it. As long as the person is doing everything we want them to do and saying everything we want them to say, we can love them unconditionally. And then the moment that that they do something else, it's, well, now just a minute here, a little bit of judgment is
Right.
creeping in. So as you were saying and as I was saying, it's really about the silence,
Mm.
um, and to teach that is challenging. I also teach classes,
Mhm.
and I teach the most elementary classes so that to help people understand science of mind. But I also teach more advanced classes, and I can see people struggling to get their minds around things. And I just keep saying to them, in the silence, there are so many answers. To try to get people to be still, to be silent for even 10 minutes a day is a challenge. And I mean, they have good intentions.
Well,
Um,
and like silent, with your mouth shut is easy, but silent in here for 10 minutes is good luck with
yes.
that.
Well, I remember years and years ago, Marianne Williamson saying, that whenever she would meditate, she meditated every day, but she said whenever she would meditate, that she would be hysterical for the first 10 minutes.
Mm,
Like, she has such a busy, busy mind.
yeah,
But she said after 10 minutes, she could then kind of quieten down and then, kind of go into that beautiful silent place where there's no beginning and no end.
mm,
And, I thought, well, she had been practicing metaphysics for so many years, and if she had a problem with it, then there's no reason why anybody should be ashamed or shy about saying, I have a problem with this. It's just a matter of practicing it, and staying with it.
absolutely. Yeah.
And lives change. I mean, I, I can, and the thing is, you don't have to have an intense thought and then hang on to it. You're kind of hanging on to it. You're not allowing it to get out there.
Hmm.
But you can have a desire that is in your heart, and all of a sudden there it is in front of you. An example, about maybe 6 months ago, I noticed when I was driving, I kept seeing these new cars that had a different shape to them out on the highway, and I would look at them and I think, oh, nice cars. I wasn't thinking about buying a new car. I had my cars fairly old, but I kept seeing these new cars and just thinking, oh, really nice, really nice. Maybe someday I'll. And my birthday was just a few weeks ago, and I have a very dear friend in the States, and he called me on my birthday and he said, I just want you to know I'm putting a down payment on a new car for you. And so he said, you choose the one that you want.
Hmm.
And I mean, it wasn't going to be a Tesla, but
Is
and
that the what? Is that the kind you've been seeing around town, or what?
no,
Okay.
no, I had been seeing Honda Civics, and I had been seeing Subarus, and I had seen a lot of I don't even know how to pronounce it, Hyundai,
Hmm.
and just thinking, oh, that's a pretty looking car, and then I'm not somebody who ever does a lot of research into things, and but um, the new Elantra spoke to me, and I looked it up, and it was named Car of the Year.
Mm,
So I thought, oh, okay, well then I'll buy that. So that's what
nice.
I've done. But uh, to that end, years ago in Banff, I was in the film and television business, and I ran a huge international festival. And I was walking down the street one day, and there was a Honda Accord on the street, and I needed to buy a car because the one that my husband had bought a new car, but it kept stalling and in snow,
Mm.
which is no good when you're on your way to Calgary to the airport. So anyway, I was walking down the street one day in Banff, and this Honda Accord just said to me, I'm your car. And so I went into Calgary the next day and I bought one like that.
Yeah.
Got back to my office, and a colleague of mine in Edmonton phoned me and he said, Carrie, I bought a new car. And I said, so did I. And he said, I bought a Honda Accord. And I said, so did I. And he said, I got this wonderful cranberry colored Honda. And I said, that's the one I bought. And anyway, every single thing. And he said, you probably did what I did. He said, it's such a pain. He said, I've been reading every consumer magazine and I've test driven every car. And that's the one I came up with. And I said, oh no, I walked down the street a couple of days ago and it said, I'm your car, and I bought it. So, um, so I've always worked intuitively.
Mhm.
I didn't even think about that at the time, but that's the way that I've always worked. And that is so in alignment with Science of Mind that, you know, it wasn't a challenge for me to get into this teaching. And I never thought I was going to be a minister, though. You
Hmm.
know, I was just interested in going deeper into the studies. So
Even after being a 2-year-old, lining up your cousins, you had no inkling that this was gonna be in your
no,
future? No?
no, I didn't. When we moved a lot when I was little, and whenever we moved, I would immediately find a church.
Mhm.
Um, and I would go, and I mean, my friends all thought I was nuts. You know, I mean, what kid goes to church on Sunday? But I always did. And then my first career was in journalism at the Calgary Herald, and it was kitty corner from the United Church of Canada, big United Church in downtown Calgary. And so on Sundays I would have to work, but I would go to the United Church first and then to
Hmm.
work. So that was always part of my life. And then um, it for me, it was a place I could go and just be, you know, could sit in the silence. I don't know if I ever really listened to many of the messages.
I was gonna say, you don't seem that, like, fond or, attached to Christianity at all, so the fact that you went to this Christian church for years, but didn't
Yeah.
really take much from it, aside from the feeling of community and whatever else, right, you got
And
there,
it wasn't
so
even about community. I mean, I
no.
was would just be in and out. But
Hmm.
and when I was in Banff, when my children were growing up, I taught Sunday school, which was a way of escaping listening to the ministers speaking. Uh, Sorry, Frank, if you're still alive.
Oh.
But but I realized when I started studying science of mind that that's what I was teaching the kids.
Mm.
Again, it was an intuitive thing. You know, I would take them out into nature and talk about this energy that's in everything, and we would collect God things for our God table,
Yeah.
you know, that sort of thing. So I just was never pulled into anything in a serious way. And even in one of the things I love about Science of Mind is Ernest Holmes said, "Stay open at the top."
Mm.
Um, you know, he said, you know, there is not just this is not the be all and end all.
Mhm.
You know, that everybody has their own truth. You have an inner truth, and there will be new things revealed. Stay open to it. And if it feels right to you, then, you know, use it. And if it doesn't feel right, run.
Mm.
Um, and and I really love that. It's not about, well, if you come in here, you're going to have to believe this, folks.
Right.
You know,
Which
it's
again, to
not
me
like,
is a sign that you're missing the mark. Anybody who comes in and tells you, "This is the 100% truth, I'm 100% sure of it, and everything else is wrong," is like, "Well, I know where you stand, see ya." I don't
yeah,
need any of
exactly.
that.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, you basically say, you know, well, there's your truth, there's my truth, and then there's the truth. But
Right.
we only know as much as we can absorb and into our own being, and as much as we can, I think I have to say, as much as we can feel, as
Yeah.
opposed to what we can think. You know, I mean, yes, you know, our minds are organs of thought, but you know, there's this great mind out there that is everything, and it's what connects us all. Um, and I think, you know, to the degree that we love and care for one another, and I'm talking about family specifically,
Mhm.
we're completely connected. I mean, one of my daughters was a ski racer, and I can remember I was walking down the street in New York City one day. I had an office there when I was doing this festival, and all of a sudden I saw my daughter's knee. Her name is Kendall, and I thought, that's Kendall's knee. She's hurt herself. And she was at a ski camp in Oregon. She was my lead athlete. And it was still bothering me the next morning, so I phoned the camp and asked for her. And the woman who answered said, oh, she's out on the hill. And I said, will you please check? And she said, well, I have to go to her cottage. She said, it'll take 10 minutes. I said, it doesn't matter how long it takes. I need to know she's okay.
Mhm.
So it was about 15 minutes, and Kendall came to the phone, sleepy little voice, and she said, oh, Mom, I hurt my knee.
Mm.
And I said, I was walking down the street yesterday and I saw it. And she said, it's going to be okay. It's just I can't ski right now. So, and then she was a journalist in South Africa, and we had many connections like that as she was in
Mhm.
terrible danger. So, you know, we
Wow.
all have those connections with our children and with dear friends. And to me, that's kind of how, you know, we're individualized expressions of this intelligence, and yet we're still all connected.
Mhm.
And I was just reading yesterday about about the connection with animals, and there've been so many stories through the years, and some that I use in my talks. And one that I just love is, I can't remember the man's name, but he was in Africa, and he was trying to save the elephants there, and he worked with elephants for quite a period of time. And his home was, I think, something like 10 kilometers away from the nearest elephant. And and when he died, all of the elephants in that herd lined up
Hmm.
one by one and went to his home and
Wow.
circled his home and made a sound together. And I mean, that just, it just astonishes me,
Hmm.
when you think that they knew this person who loved them and who cared about them had gone, and they needed to come and honor him. And we hear about somebody's dog that gets lost in Florida and finds its way to Vancouver, by some strange, I mean, nobody knows how. The family has moved, and the dog winds up on their doorstep. Every once in a
Yeah.
while, there's a wonderful story like that.
That's a
I mean,
Disney movie right there.
yeah, yeah, but it shows the connection that we have that's in the invisible.
Yep.
And if we could just, Emerson said, "Get your bloated nothingness out of the way."
That's what our
And
thoughts are oftentimes. They're just bloated nothingness, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
so if we could get our bloated nothingness out of the way, we could allow so much more to come in, and so much more. We'd have so much more wisdom, I think.
Hmm.
Wisdom
Yeah.
is those. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the things that you're talking about to me seem to indicate again that the mind can just get in the way and that beliefs and expectations and all these different things that we hold on to, they become like clutter. And then it's
Yeah.
like if you've got a bunch of crap on your kitchen table, you can't see the table itself. You got to like sweep some stuff off the table
Yeah.
and then you can actually see what's there instead of all the crap that you've kind of put on top of it.
Yeah.
And yeah, all those examples that you use, like the car, it just you didn't think about it. It wasn't like you
Yeah.
went and researched it and all this stuff like your colleague did. It spoke to you, and there was nothing in
Mhm.
the way of that voice. It just went, and you heard it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so, and the animals are the same too. I mean, they don't have this like talking voice in their head like we do, right? So when you look at flocks of birds, pardon me, and the way that they move in unison without any words exchanged, right? One tips a wing and they all follow in unison. They're all connected, like you're saying, mentally together. They're like one being essentially in multiple birds. We see that with animals all the time, and we're capable of it. Same as they are.
Exactly. It's so beautiful. Um, yesterday I also read about someone who took care of bees. Many beehives, was wanting to preserve the bees on this planet that are
Yeah.
starting to disappear. And I don't remember how many hives he had, but so many of them. And it wasn't about honey, it was just about,
Yeah.
keeping them alive and helping them to breed and so on. And when he died, he was being buried in a coffin, and the coffin was lowered into the grave, and thousands of bees
Hmm.
came in a swarm and sat for a half an hour on the coffin, stopped on the coffin, and then
Wow.
together flew off. And I just,
Wild.
the magnificence of that, the magnificence of the connection, and again, it's love. It's the love that he showed for the bees. It's the
Hmm.
love that the other men showed for the elephants.
Yeah.
Um, uh, one of my daughters is really connected to animals and well, to all kinds of life. And she and her husband studied in Maui for a year before they moved to Victoria. And they would go out on a boat from time to time with friends, and a whale would breach right up beside the boat to my daughter, would
Hmm.
let her touch
Wow.
its snout. Wouldn't let anybody else come near it. But
Yeah.
and she and her husband used to swim every morning underwater really early in the morning so they could listen to the whale's song.
Hmm.
There was a connection there. When If we could just allow ourselves, instead of being so busy, to just be in that place, in that space, and to know that it's okay not to do anything.
Hmm.
It's okay to just go and sit by the water. And during the pandemic, what better time? You know, I was going through it pretty well, when we were first closed down. We had to close down our center in I guess it was March, and and I think by about the end of May, I was getting a little squirrely. But I started getting into my car every day and just driving.
Yeah.
And then I would find a place by the water, any water, any beach, anywhere. And if there were no people, I would just get out, sit in the sun by a rock,
Yeah.
and just sit and look at the water. And the things that come to you, when you just allow yourself to do that. And yet, and I'm somebody who can make myself way too busy.
Hmm.
So I'm saying that, I'm not criticizing somebody else. I'm criticizing myself for
Of
not.
course. Yeah, we're all working on our own things, right? But
Yeah,
you're so right. I mean, just taking the time to be,
yeah.
it's a luxury that, we have, but we rarely take. And yeah, it's too bad.
Well, and it's more challenging, I think, when you have little children. Um, they need you, and they need your
Absolutely.
time.
I think
Um,
the key is to be present while you're doing stuff. It's You don't have to sit on a cushion, and you don't have to, you can be present when you're doing anything.
yes,
It's just, again, it comes down to the mind. The mind is what separates us from the present moment. And so if I'm doing the dishes and I'm thinking about what I'm going to make for dinner, and I'm asking my kid about homework, I'm lost. But if I do the dishes and I just do the dishes,
yeah,
that is a deeply spiritual experience.
it's very zen.
It's as
It's
stupid as
very
it's,
zen.
yeah, very much so, right? I mean, you're just present and you
Yeah,
become the task. And yeah, I think it's, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that it's not what you're doing, it's the spirit in which you do it. And it's so
mm,
tricky to explain that, but like, you could do the same thing, but if you do it with one attitude versus another attitude, they're very different experiences. And
absolutely.
in one
And
way
we,
it's valuable, and another way it's a detriment. It's
yeah,
bad for you almost.
yeah. And we get to choose.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We get to consciously choose every moment the way we're going to feel about whatever it is that we're doing. Or I mean, something terrible can happen to someone, and or say to two people, and each of them will respond in a different way.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, even things that aren't so terrible. There are people who complain about absolutely everything.
That's right.
But the thing is, when you get up in the morning and you just, I love what Wayne Dyer used to say. When you get up in the morning, do you say, "Oh God, it's morning," or do you say, "Good morning, God"? And
Very good. Yeah.
and I just love that.
Yeah.
Um, it's the way that you set the tone for the day, or good morning, spirit, or look at the sunrise. Listen to the birds. I mean,
Hmm.
before the snowfall, I was listening to the birds chirping, and I thought, oh yes, the sounds of spring. It's
Yeah.
so lovely to wake up to and we live in such an amazing place. Um, but we can always choose under any circumstances. I mean, when you think about people who have been, well, I'm thinking about people. Who was the famous psychologist who was in
Viktor
a
Frankl.
concentration camp? Viktor Frankl. Yeah, who survived the horrors of a concentration camp, mostly by thinking about the home that he left, his wife, the fire that they sat by when he was out with his feet freezing, with
Yeah.
no socks, no laces in his boots. I mean, truly, um, I mean that to me, he expressed pure spirit um, in such a magnificent way. Um, and again, it's such an example
Hmm.
of the choice. And I was reading. I don't. I've been reading a book by Larry Dossey called One Mind, and he mentioned something in it about when the Jewish people were liberated from concentration camps, and he said when the American soldiers went into some of them, they were just. I mean, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. I mean, in one of the camps, the Germans hadn't even buried the bodies; they just piled them up, and everybody had been starving. Everyone was skin and bones, and they had lost their sense of identity. There was no sense of who they were in any way. And someone decided that the women needed lipstick, and they brought in thousands of tubes of lipstick, and said to the women, "If you would like to have a lipstick, you can have one." And the women, they were so thrilled. Everyone was using lipstick, and everything about them changed, because they were able to feel like they were themselves
Mm.
again. And he tells a moving story about one woman who died. She was just, she basically starved to death. And when they went to pick her up to take her to bury her, in her hand she had the tube of
Hmm.
lipstick. And when we think about it, the simplest things can make us happy if we look at them as the gifts that they are to us.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have much time for people who are complaining all the time or living in drama all the time. Um, I mean, I'll pray for them, but I don't want to listen to it. And
It's tough. Yeah,
yeah,
in my experience, through work, I've had a number of these people, in my office or whatever, and they make the rounds. And whenever they get to me, I have the best solution. You just flip it on them. Anything negative, you're like, well, on the bright side, you do
yes,
that a couple times, they leave you alone. They never want to talk to you because they don't want a solution. They don't want
no,
a positive benefit out of this thing that they're complaining about. They just want to complain, right?
that's
And
so true.
that's where they're at, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just like you, I don't want to be contaminated with that energy. I don't want to be around that a lot. If I
Yeah.
don't have if I have a choice in the matter, let's say. But yeah, so what do you do like when you're breaking it down for people? Because I mean, I find that a lot of this stuff, like we were kind of saying earlier, if until you experience it, it's hard to intellectualize.
Hmm.
So what, like maybe as a sort of a parting gift for us, because we're almost up, what would be something, how would you get someone interested at least in this topic, knowing that it's so difficult to gain traction and there's all these different ideas? Like, do you have a hook or something that you would like use to just, this usually works? Like, what is that if you have one?
Oh, if I did, I'd probably have 3,000 people somewhere on a Wednesday night.
So it doesn't get easier with time. It's
No,
never
um,
easy.
basically, I think there are a lot of people seeking. And what I find is, I'll have people call me and say, I would like you to do a wedding, or I'd like you to do a funeral, or a celebration of life service for us. And at some point, they will say, well, what is it? What is your religion? And then I try as simply as possible to tell them. But usually, I try to shrink it down into one line,
Mhm.
and I say to them, I find the easiest thing to say so that you can understand where I am with it is to call it the Church of Oprah. And when I say that, all of a sudden they light up, they get it. And then people will often say, "Oh, well, where are you? Like, where can I come?" And because they understood her spiritual nature, they listened to some of the people she interviewed and who were very spiritual authors and so on.
Mhm.
And so I find that's the best hook of all is to just call it the Church of Oprah. And in terms,
Thank you, Oprah.
yeah, and in terms of promoting it, we'll basically say, if you like the works of Marianne Williamson and Wayne Dyer and Louise Hay and um, various authors,
Yeah,
spiritual authors, and if you like Oprah, you're going to love us.
there you go. Yeah.
And so once they come in the door, for me, the most important thing is the feeling. And every once in a while, I need to be talking about quantum physics. And of course, that takes everybody into the intellect.
Hmm.
And my topic for Valentine's Day was supposed to be one that had to do with quantum physics.
Yeah.
And I thought, I can't do that. It's Valentine's Day. And I thought this might seem like it's, you know, mindless to a lot of people. But anyway, I did a service on love.
Hmm.
And I had email after email after email from people saying, I love today's service. And I thought, go back to what I believe.
Yeah.
Go back to what's important to me is to sharing my heart, not sharing my brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Uh, I just finished reading
people need
this,
to.
The Tao of
Oh, the Tao of
Physics.
Physics. Oh my gosh, I read that about 30 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
I
great
found
one.
it at Value Village and I was like, well, that's definitely mine. I mean, the Tao is one of my favorite sort of symbols and
Yeah.
philosophies. But what I was going to say is with quantum physics, what I love about quantum physics is that it's basically the mind leveraging itself to get beyond itself. Because if you follow the sort of logic of quantum mechanics, you get to a point where nothing makes sense anymore.
Yeah.
And that to me is almost like a symbol for the mystical experience that I had, because I got into it by thinking about stuff. And as the thoughts led me, they brought me to a place that was beyond thinking. So it was like most people, they meditate, they bring quiet to the mind. But for me, it was the opposite. It was the chatter in the mind that was flowing in this certain direction that brought me to this place that was completely beyond the mind, that I couldn't talk about without making myself sound like a crazy person, and that I couldn't understand. It made me question everything, because I realized, wow, crap, none of this stuff that I thought was real or true is real or true anymore. So, and that's what happens with quantum physics. These physicists are following the line of reasoning of, let's find the smallest unit of matter, to the point where they realize, oh shit, there's no matter.
Exactly. And then what? And I can remember scientists saying this like 30, 40 years ago, even that,
Yeah.
when asked, when they would talk about particles, they weren't talking about particles then, but when they were talking about how things were created, and people would say, yes, but, what's in between the spaces? What? And they say, well, they said that, well, there seems to be some kind of an intelligence. And I remember when I first heard that, all of a sudden it was, yes, like
Hmm.
I let out this big sigh. I don't have to try and figure it out. The intelligence is
Right.
already there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that you again, you're a very spiritual person, but obviously you value the scientific method, and you get, it sounds like to me like what science reveals to you makes you feel awe and wonder at this intelligence. So it's not like you're
Yeah.
becoming this hardcore atheist because you're like all about science and reason. It's like, no, the science takes you to the same place as spirituality and meditation. They're all leading to this one pinnacle experience. And
Yeah.
like you, I think the first time I started to feel really spiritual about God and creation was from watching Cosmos, Neil deGrasse Tyson, when they rebooted it. And I was
Right.
watching it, and it was blowing my mind and opening my heart and making me feel all of this like gratitude and wonder at the universe. And I was like, oh, that's what religious people feel like. I
Yeah.
understand God now. Like,
I know. Yeah. I can remember as a child lying on my back in the grass in the summer, looking at the stars
hmm,
and thinking, okay, so here we are on the earth, being held here by gravity. And, we're part of this solar system, which is part of the Milky Way galaxy, which is part of, and I mean, and at the time I had no idea the enormity of,
right.
of, of the universe or universes, if there's more than one.
Yeah.
And that the stars or the universe is expanding at something like 100 million miles a minute.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know who the traffic cop is who's out there
Yeah. We're the
measuring,
speed limits.
but yeah, but I mean, the wonder of it, we cannot comprehend, as you said earlier, we can't comprehend what God is.
Hmm.
There are no words to explain that. But there is a feeling,
Absolutely.
and when we can be there, I think that's what it's all about. And that we can do anything if we can be there. If we could just share that with
Hmm.
everybody on the planet, and if everybody on the planet could have, I keep saying every week, if love could be awakened in every heart, there could be no suffering. There could be no hungry person on this planet. There could be no homeless person. Um, there could not be a war. Um,
What you're saying is we have everything we need to make this a reality right now. All we're missing is the love, and then obviously the
yeah.
willingness to act on that love.
Yeah. So to me, I guess in the final analysis, love is all there is.
Hmm.
You know, um, if we can all but open and connect to it, it's there. It's there in the invisible.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I think
Yeah.
I think those are the best closing words that we could have come up with. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Great, Ollie. Lovely to talk to you today.
Very much so. Yes. Thank you so much for making the time, and yeah, hopefully we can do it again.
Okay, my pleasure. I'd love to do it again.